Good morning, colleagues. Welcome once again to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on reparations and sexual and gender-based violence in Africa. It's really great to have you all here with us. Just before we start, as we start, just some house rules, just for you to know that firstly, we have interpretation. So if anyone needs interpretation, we have French to English interpretation today. If you just go to the bottom of your screen and you press on more, you'll find the interpretation button there, and you can just choose French if you need that interpretation. So in terms of our agenda, I'm just going to open up the meeting, and then I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Ms. Anna Moyo, for welcome remarks, after which I'll then introduce our first speaker, Dr. Nyoki Wamai, and she will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then after that, I'll then introduce our second speaker, Ms. Mariama Jobarteh, who will also speak for about 10 minutes as well, after which we'll then open it up for the plenary session for questions, comments, and let's have this conversation, because I think it's an important conversation. So I am Nyari Pariola. I'm an advocacy specialist here at CSVR, and it is my privilege to serve as your moderator today. As we gather here, I think we are presented with a pivotal opportunity to engage in a critical dialogue about reparations and their transformative potential in addressing SGBV across Africa. I really believe that the AU's 2025 theme resonates deeply with our collective mission to foster justice and healing in our societies. And, since the recognition of systemic SGBV as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in the 1998 Rome Statute, we have seen the evolution of international frameworks aimed at combating this grave issue. With ongoing conflicts heightening the risks of SGBV, it is crucial that we examine the insights offered by scholars in this field. In today's discussion, will center on the necessity of reparations as a means to disrupt cycles of violence and address the enduring impact of SGBV. We are privileged to have a distinguished panel of experts who will share their insights and experiences, helping us to navigate these complex issues and identify actionable pathways forward. To you, our esteemed audience, policymakers, practitioners, civil society leaders, academics, your participation is also vital. Please also share about how we can advance justice and ensure that the voices of those affected by SGBV are heard and upheld. Thank you for joining us today. And now, without much further ado, I'm going to invite our Executive Director, Ms. Anna Moyo, to please give us her welcome remarks. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Nyari. Good morning. I hope it's morning everywhere. And good day to everyone. On this note, I would like to welcome us all to this webinar, where we are focusing basically on reparations for gender-based violence and reparations for sexual violence experienced by women. I think it's really timely for us to host this webinar at CSVR in this month of June. There is a number of commemorations worldwide in this month of June, and also here in South Africa at a national level in the month of June, that are really befitting and also touch on women's experiences in all their diversity in particular. For instance, just on the 19th of June, we commemorated the International Day on the elimination of conflict-related sexual violence. Again, this is an experience that women disproportionately have to face globally. On the 21st of June, it was World Refugee Day. Again, we see a lot of women who are refugees experiencing untold, gruesome and grueling experiences, particularly around rape, around sexual violence, be it from the host country where they will be fleeing from conflict en route to places of refuge or countries of refuge as they try and navigate their passage to countries of safety. And also in host countries where they have sought refuge, for instance, where again, sometimes they are subjected to sexual violence as a way of survival. We also see women internally displaced, as internally displaced persons in camps, also experiencing sexual violence, sometimes in exchange for food, in exchange for some of the services that they desperately need. Also, on the 26th of June, we will be commemorating World Torture Day. Again, an experience that many women have undergone in their countries of origin. Again, we know from international human rights law that rape is also a form of torture, is another form of torture, and women have experienced this form of torture disproportionately. Here in South Africa, on the 16th of June, we celebrated National Youth Day. Again, women as youth have also been on the forefront of some of the very violations that we are talking about. So it's really befitting for us to commemorate this day. Again, rounding it up as well with the African Union theme of the year, which focuses on reparations, or rather justice for African people and people of African descent, and reparations is really at the heart of it. But as CSVR, we see it befitting to have a dedicated webinar that focuses on reparations for women's experiences, looking specifically at how women's reparations are attending to women's experiences, particularly experiences of sexual violence, experiences of gender-based violence in conflict settings, and experiences of conflict-related sexual violence, amongst others. We all know that women basically continue to suffer, and when we talk about gender-based violence in conflict settings, in peace settings, gender-based violence is usually in a continuum. It gets exacerbated during conflict settings, it gets exacerbated during times of crisis, and women bear basically the brunt of some of these experiences. And in many instances, when we speak of transitional justice in particular, we usually approach reparations for women's experiences using a one-size-fits-all approach, where there is no nuanced approach to awarding reparations for women that will attend, or rather respond to, their very peculiar experiences during conflict. So we have come from the South African TRC process, where although women's experiences came out, however, the award of reparations of $3,000 were applied across the board as a one-size-fits-all, without particular attention to women's peculiar experiences. However, coming from that experiences and applying some of the lessons learned, we have really moved, and we have come a long way to really addressing women's experiences, not only as something to mention within Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, but also to specific interventions during reparations awards that respond to women's issues. So as we discussed today, I think I just want, as part of my welcoming remarks, to just say that some of the experiences and some of the reflections from Truth and Reconciliation Commission processes in Morocco, in Tunisia, in the Gambia, amongst other contexts, are really good practices that we are noting and continuously reflecting on as part of where we come from and how far we have come in addressing women's experiences in particular through reparation awards, and responding to some of their experiences during conflicts and addressing those not as a one-size-fits-all, but as a nuanced and very much contextually relevant and meaningful reparations that respond to those very experiences. I encourage everyone today to really engage in this robust discussion and also share experiences that are worth noting and worth emulating and replicating around how far we have come in addressing women's experiences, conflict-related sexual violence, gender-based violence that is experienced through transitional justice. Again, Reparations gives us really that platform to respond to some of these experiences. And as we hear today from Dr. Nyoki Wamai, as we hear from Mariama Jobarteh, again, I encourage us to really learn from some of their experiences, some of what they will be saying today. And really, we are encouraged by some of these experiences and looking at building upon that to improve current and future practice of transitional justice, particularly in affording women reparations to respond to some of their experiences during conflict, during crisis, and any other occurrence that necessitates a transitional justice process. On this note, I welcome you all and deem the meeting open and looking forward to robust discussions, reflections, and sharing of experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for those welcome remarks, and especially for just amplifying the need for a nuanced, contextualized approach that seeks to actually address the unique experiences and barriers that women face in this regard. Thank you so much. Colleagues, we're now going to move to our panelists. But before I introduce Dr. Nyoki, I just want to reiterate, because I see we have more people who've joined, that we have interpretation. So please, if you just go to the bottom of your screen, choose more, and then interpretation. We have French interpretation today for those who might need that. And if you're posting as well about this webinar, please don't forget to tag us at _CSVR on your social media platforms. Thank you, colleagues. All right, so I'm now going to ask our first speaker, Dr. Nyoki Wamai, to speak. Dr. Nyoki Wamai is an assistant professor at the International Relations Department at the United States International University, Africa. She was a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Governance and Human Rights, CGHR, and the Politics and International Studies Department at the University of Cambridge. She also completed a PhD actually in Politics and International Studies as a Gates Cambridge Scholar at Cambridge University. Her research focus is on mediation, gender, women, peace and security, international criminal court, and international intervention. And she has published book chapters and articles on these issues and topics in the Oxford University Press, Routledge, among others. Previously, Dr. Nyoki was a Peace and Security and Development Scholar at the African Leadership Center at King's College London, and she's also appeared on Arise News, BBC News, The Guardian, discussing and commenting on contemporary issues in African issues internationally. So Dr. Nyoki, thank you for being here today. Please, may you go ahead and make your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nyaradzo, and Anna, and everybody at the Center for Violence and Reconciliation for inviting me. Inviting me to be part of this, I think, important webinar, especially this year of the year of reparations. As you all know, and I think Anna has also mentioned, this is the African Union theme of the year. And for us who are transitional justice scholars and practitioners, we were very happy, I think, because we've been talking about some of these issues, of course, based from also the transitional justice policy for the African Union. So we're very happy that it was labeled the year, and I hope we can do more. It's not just talk, especially by the African Union. And one of the people one group that of course gets ignored even in these conversations of reparations, especially at the African Union, given its patriarchal structure and the history, is women, and more so survivors and victims of sexual and gender-based violence. So this is very important, and so thank you very much for doing this. I think it's so important that we continue doing this. We probably develop even a policy paper, because I don't think the AU even has an idea. When they think about reparations, everybody's thinking about reparations for slavery, reparations for Of course, slavery, for also the economic inequalities that have continued after Africa was exploited by the colonial powers, so reparations for colonization. But then we don't look at who are these people? How do they look like? You know, and that's where women get lost. That's where children get lost, for people who work on children. Many people don't think, what are reparations actually also for children? So many marginalized communities are often ignored when we talk about conversations on reparations, because we focus on this big thing. And because of even international relations, the nature of the state and what we would say the male state and the way the state thinks of itself, and largely because the AU is thinking about the states, because the AU, of course, is an intergovernmental body based on, as much as they will say the people's, based on its chart, on its governing instruments, or it's still largely based on states, and that's why it's the state, the summit, that makes decisions, as much as we could be there as observers, or we could have observer status. That's why we are not the ones making decisions. So it's very important we continue reminding them, when we think about reparations, there are different groups of people who need reparations, and different people are affected in different ways. But just to get into my conversation, I hope this is a conversation. It is very important. I was just looking at some of the statistics, and the World Bank reports that an estimated 612 million women and girls lived in 2023, lived within 50 kilometers of a conflict, and an increase of 41%. So in 2023, 50 kilometers of women and girls lived, 612 million women and girls lived 50 kilometers away or near a conflict. And this is 41% higher than in 2015. So it tells you we are not at a good place. And I can imagine in 2024, it's even worse. And so it makes women and girls likely to even experience sexual and gender-based violence if 612 million in the world are living within that. Of course, incidence reports just in 2023, about 3,788 incidents of conflict-related sexual violence were reported. And what are these forms of sexual violence that women and girls experience within conflict context? I believe we all know rape, sexual slavery, and we've seen a lot of that. We've seen so many cases, Bring Back the Girls in Nigeria. There are all these incidents, even in smaller conflicts. We've heard about sexual slavery, which continues in northern Uganda, in places in eastern, inside that conflict, even in DRC, especially rape, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, again, if they think that you're going to have, they want to get rid of the enemy's children, forced abortion, forced sterilization, forced marriage. And now we're dealing with conflicts that are now increasingly interrelated with other issues like climate change. And so there's a lot of forced marriages because girls are seen as the easiest thing to bring us money in periods of strain, especially with the increasing effects of climate change. So there's a lot of forced marriages, and in context like in Eastern Africa and Northern Africa and West Africa, where there are high rates of female genital cutting or female genital mutilation, again, a lot of increased sexual violence of that nature, of female genital cutting. So that if the girl is already, if she goes through FGM, it means now she can easily be sold off for marriage, and so the family can get the money they're looking for. And of course, and many other forms of sexual violence. So this is just a few of those. So, and especially happening in our African context. So, and not just women and girls who are in those rural, in those places of conflict are affected. We've seen so much: educators, aid workers, health workers, especially the more people who are affected, because aid workers and educators could have a power, could be they are more powerful in this local context, but the most affected, of course, are the local populations, internally displaced people, refugees, being especially very vulnerable. And across the world, Africa, Oceania, and South Asia have the highest rate of violence within conflicts, and a lot of work needs to be done. So when we look at reparations, most, and now especially given, as we are saying, it's the year of the African Union and African Union looking at reparations, the more we actually need to take this opportunity as practitioners to get into those rooms, whether we're going to write policy briefs or have conversations with them and tell them, this is what reparations for sexual and gender-based violence looks like. And first of all, these are the number of, also showing them the numbers. These are the number of people who are affected by sexual and gender-based violence. And if we cannot talk about reparations, just thinking about the past, without thinking about what reparations for people who have gone through sexual and gender-based violence would look like. And this is what it would look like. I think we need to propose, and I believe already, given the work that the Center for Violence done, you've already done this already. So it's not something new. So many times, reparations for survivors of sexual gender-based violence should take at least the forms that we say, whether it's restitution, I mean, based on the principles of restorative justice. As we know, reparations at the measures that we take to acknowledge harm and also to make sure that we do no harm after this and to provide redress. And there are like about 5 forms of reparations, which I believe I'm speaking to the choir. Restitution, which is of course restoring rights and the dignity, and especially for women who have gone through sexual violence. I think this is one of the most important, restoring your dignity, because that is what has been taken away through this. So when we look at most of the reparations, like I'm happy Anna and many others, we participated like in some process you saw in Juba. When we looked at reparations, there's even a whole reparations authority proposed. When you look at the Kenyan process of transitional justice, it never even had a reparations authority or a reparations process. So politicians then instrumentalized reparations. And that's what got people who were indicted by the International Criminal Court back into power, because there was no policy, there was nothing institutionalized on reparations. And again, so that's the Kenyan context. Maybe Mariama will speak about the Liberian context. Maybe with a feminist leader, it was a much better process. But we've seen when we do not institutionalize reparations, it leads to a lot of interpretations that, of course, that often ignores specific violence that women have gone through, and especially sexual violence. So and restitution, I was trying to say, if we don't institutionalize restitution, which is about restoring your dignity. So the second one is reparation, compensation. So restitution, compensation. And most countries, that's what they will do. Compensation, whether it's financial, material, most of the time financial. You will get that $3,000 package, which people got in South Africa. Even in Kenya, politicians instrumentalized it, given different people, or they were given different packages, but it's basically a monetary compensation, often about loss of your house, loss of your land, and often to men, because, you know, women still don't have land rights in this context of ours, or women don't have property rights as much as it's there on paper, on constitution, but culturally, many of them, as long as you have, for instance, gotten married, you lose all your rights from your home, or even if you're married, you don't really have the title, land title. So compensation needs to be gendered, but many times that's the when you look at the African Union, that's even what they're demanding, say, from these global powers that colonized us, that enslaved us, not global powers, but those countries. I think we need to stop using such words, global powers. It's also decolonize ourselves. But those countries that occupied us, that, you know, that harmed us and exploited us, and continue to do so. So the AU is demanding compensation through, for instance, bilateral aid and that kind of thing. But nobody then thinks about, during that time of enslavement, the many women, because this was also a time of conflict, the many women who went sexual violence, we may not find them, but those life histories are there. Colonialism, those stories are still there. I am Kenyan Kikuyu from Nyeri. It's a place where the Mau Mau, if you've heard about the Mau Mau, the people who fought the British guerrilla war in the 1950s come from. So this is stories my grandmother would tell me. She could not hear on one ear, and she would say, I was hit with a baton by a British soldier because I had refused to go and do forced labor. So this, others will tell you about sexual violence. I participated in the Mau Mau case, and I know I helped a lot when I used to work for the Kenya Human Rights Commission. So we did the report taking, and we took lots of reports on sexual violence. This is just 60, 70 years ago. So, but even when the British compensated the few, I think there were about 4,000 people for $3,000, 3,000 pounds. They just did what do you call it? A very general lump sum for everybody. Nobody thought about how do we restitute these old grandmas whose dignity was taken away because they would thrust hot water bottles inside their vaginas as a form of violence for women who are participating in the Mau Mau. So, but they were all given the same $3,000, and it's not all of them. It's just the few that we could prove medically that you have a problem because of the violence. So restitution is one place where we have a huge gap, that restoring dignity. Compensation, they'll do that, but then that's where restitution issues are ignored. Rehabilitation, again, that's a very huge gap because that's where most victims of sexual violence, that's what they need. And I'm happy with the work that Center for Violence and Reconciliation is doing, because I know you're very big on wellness, healthcare, counseling, rehabilitation. Again, we need to continue doing this because if you look at across most of these countries, again, Kenya, we also went through such a process. There was nothing like rehabilitation, right? And that's where we can that's where we can be able to deal with restitution, because it's restoring dignity through rehabilitation, through counseling, through a lifelong therapy, through, so, and then satisfaction. That's the next principle. Public apologies, memorials. Sexual violence, of course, because of the nature, you may not want a huge public apology there sometimes of your name with everybody in the community knowing what may happen to you, or your name written, you went through that. But even it can be done in a way that dignifies you. So most of the time we will say these men were shot somewhere. Like in Kenya, you have a certain group, Somali group, shot by the government in the 1980s. What about the women who were raped? What about the women who do not want their names maybe written in a public memorial because people will know this happened to them? How do we go around that? So for me, I'm putting questions also out there for us to start thinking. And then guarantees of non-repetition. So through reforms, constitutional reforms, that's why we have constitutions that ensure or that make sure, for instance, to make torture illegal, sexual violence illegal, and of course, very serious penalties if you do those kind of things through the courts. So, and a lot of public education. And of course, eventually we want a change of culture so that even in times of conflict and strife, these things don't happen. And I know, and also we have lots of legal frameworks which can support us to do this, whether it's CEDAW or the many conventions that Anna spoke about. You all know we also have 1325 and about 10 other resolutions passed by the UN Security Council to guarantee this. And for those pathways of justice to happen, I'm about to stop in a minute, we want survivor-centered approaches. And that's the challenge, I think. The AU and even the mini TJRC process or the mini transitional justice processes, whether it's in Kenya, what happened in South Africa, what is intended to happen in South Sudan, Liberia, your process, Sierra Leone, quite a number, Gambia, yours I think was much better. So that as long as one of the 4 principles, it has to ensure again, it is survivor-centered. Those pathways to justice, is it survivor-centered? If you look at those big principles I've talked about of how many transitional justice processes unfold, and how finally compensation becomes a big deal when it comes to reparations, and restitution issues of restoring dignity are left out or are not well done or well implemented. It's one of the reasons is because they are not usually survivor-centered. And it goes back to this idea of the state. Who is most important in a state? You know, it's the state, this amorphous thing, which is male-centered. So even the ideas of who suffered most, think of all your countries. When you think about, I don't know, we all have these fathers of the nation. How come we've never heard of mothers of the nation? Each of us, whether it's Zimbabwe, Kenya, Liberia, Gambia, we all have South Africa, mothers of the nation, fathers, sorry. Oh, how I wish mothers of the nation. Yeah, but nobody talks about the mothers and the women, because then we have all, somehow because of patriarchy, the state and the suffering of liberation was encapsulated, or these men were then put as the symbol of suffering, of who then suffered most. And women's struggles, when women go through a lot of violence, especially sexual violence, were ignored and erased and silenced. Whether it's liberation wars or whether it's now these many conflicts that continue. Look at what happened in the Tigray region in Ethiopia. Again, all we think about is the men, the big men who are killed. What about the many women who have suffered and suffered sexual violence? So we need to go beyond these male figures of suffering and start looking beyond the ordinary people, and that's the only way we can move to a survivor-centered approach. And we need to start, and most of the critiques we've been given, oh, it is so hard to find these ordinary people. It is too expensive. It is too long ago. How do we even verify claims? It will open more floodgates. Those are the critiques often, whether it's in practice or scholarship, you'll find. Reparations won't change the past. I think for us here, we are saying, no. For us to move forward, we have to deal with those issues and it has to be survivor-centered, community-based, and I'm glad that's what Center for Violence advocates for. A lot of strategic litigation is needed for the lawyers in the House, and also increase the role of civil society. And I believe that's where community-based, survivor-centered approaches come through. And I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nyoki, for that really great intervention. Thank you. You know, I really like the question you're asking. Where are the mothers? Where are the mothers of the nation? You know, I think, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for highlighting the intersections of violence and discrimination that women face in this regard, and all the myriad of places where, you know, this violence happens across the continent. And also, thank you so much for sharing the stats. You know, I think they really amplify the importance and the timeliness of this conversation and the need for action. 612 million, that is a lot of women. And the fact that it has increased truly speaks to the times we're living in and the need for critical interventions. And also, I think really thank you for highlighting the gaps in the reparations regime as currently practiced on the continent. You know, like you say, the importance of restoring the dignity of survivors, you know, the need for compensation for the different forms of reparation to be gendered and survivor-centered is absolutely critical, especially given the barriers that women face, as you know, as you explained already. Just if she's the one who suffered the harm, but the husband, whatever she gets, she must give it to the husband, you know, because she can't have She can have the land put in her title, or she can, if she's given money. I know there's stories from the Gambia where women, who testified on their own basis and got reparations for the harms they suffered. And so they were given monetary compensation that they had to give it to the husband because he's the head of the family, and so that's where the money goes. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for that. And I think lastly, just thank you for calling us to take the opportunity as practitioners to get in the rooms, and yeah, like for us to make the interventions, because it's needed, it's much needed. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to ask Ms. Mariama Jobarteh to also make her intervention. Mariama Jobarteh is a gender justice and mental health advocate, leading community-driven change across the Gambia and Scotland. She's the founder of Fantanka, a women-led organization championing sexual and reproductive health, trauma-informed care, and transitional justice issues in the Gambia. Mariama has worked extensively with survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, youth, and marginalized communities. She's a former psychosocial support officer for the Gambia's Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission, and she now serves as a consultant, speaker, and mentor across various international platforms. Mariama, thank you so much for being with us. Over to you.
Sorry, I was still struggling to come off mute. It's finally done. Hi, good morning here. Thank you very much for having me. It is a great pleasure to join you to talk about a topic that is really important to me, that I, enjoy talking about, not because it should be, fun topic to talk about, but because I want to contribute to addressing sexual and gender-based violence in different contexts. I want to be able to add my voice to, platforms where the voiceless people who should be here are not here. One of the problems that I find with addressing sexual and gender-based violence is, in as much as we mean well, sometimes this is the problem itself, where the survivors are not even at the table to talk about issues. We mean well, but sometimes it is a problem in itself that we report on behalf of the survivors instead of bringing survivors on the table to talk about issues. So where I want to start is when we are talking about sexual and gender-based violence in general, we have, UN Women reporting that 1 in 3 women, in normal African context, suffer sexual and gender-based violence. These figures are higher in conflict settings. We are talking about 60 to 70%, depending on where it is. So in different countries or in different conflict settings, we can see, for example, that in Nigeria, the Boko Haram people basically had over 2,000 women and girls were abducted between 2014 and 2017. They were subjected to forced marriage, rape, sexual slavery, and whatnot. Many of these women had children out of wedlock. Sorry, children were born out of rape. That is not nothing that we desire, nothing that we want to sit down and, hear about. But unfortunately, these things continue happening every time. We have places like DRC, 70% of SGBV cases were reported. The sad thing for me is the people who are supposed to be protecting women are the ones that are perpetrating the sexual violence, the rape in the context of the Gambia. We have heard over and over that state officials soldiers, paramilitaries were the ones perpetrating rape on innocent civilians who would have not done anything, to come anywhere close to having issues with them. And as a nation, we had to suffer these issues. We as women had to suffer because somebody stupidly somewhere decided that women don't have any right. Women's bodies should be used anyhow to satisfy men. So that is what it is in a nutshell. So before we start talking about reparations, I think we need to also look into how women or victims of rape are also, or their violations are also seen as politically motivated, because we have South Africans here in the South African Commission. Even though SGBV was reported, the Commission did not see it as politically motivated. So how were the victims supposed to get reparations as much as possible based on these issues? In the Gambian context, Usman Sonko was tried in Swiss, and he was punished for other crimes. But because SGBV, there was not enough evidence, or there was not enough evidence for them to be able to address SGBV violations that he has committed, or he has contributed to committing. He was not, that side of the issue was not dealt with. So if we are really serious about reparations when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence, we need to get states, we need to get, decision makers to start looking at SGBV a lot more seriously than it is actually happening right now. Sometimes people will be on the top. How seriously do they think SGBV is a problem? How seriously do they think that we need to address SGBV as much as possible? And then we look into reparations. A lot of the times when we are talking about reparations, it's mainly focused on financial reparations. They have been raped, or they have been sexually violated. So if we are sorting them out, or we are, providing reparations, it's just giving them money. If we give them money, problem solved, ignoring the fact that there are lots of other issues. One of the main ones, medical issues. How do we support them to, have medical care? The other thing is stigma. The stigma that many victims of rape hardly talk about. We as Africans, we understand how difficult it is to, to basically speak about sexual intercourse or sexual activities outside of marriage, even if it's something that you want to do willingly. Never mind being raped. The stigma on you from, your immediate family, the society, the schools you go back to, the workplaces you go back to, all of these places or people who are around you, they have got their own concept. They have got their own thoughts that they have about you, regardless of, what happens to you. The fact that people, in a lot of African settings don't even see rape as, something that is not a victim's fault at all. It's problematic, because we have like our thinking capabilities, or our the way we think needs to shift to help destigmatize rape in our African context. We then also think about now the trauma healing. How do we support women and girls who have been subject to these crimes? How do we support them? Because it's traumatizing. How do we ensure that they, to start off with, understand that it is not their fault at all? Somebody somewhere or lack of proper systems or structures in place have resulted to their lives being shattered, and nothing basically is happening about it. How do we support these women? Understanding that the African context, or in a Gambia, for example, the Western approach of trauma healing is not necessarily welcome, because it is seen as a whitewash, or kind of service that they don't really want to take on. How do we appreciate the fact that we have traditional healing mechanisms that women would prefer? How do we integrate traditional healing mechanisms with, the Western healing approach, to ensure that women and girls are receiving the support they need, the support they want, how they want it? Then we also have to look into their livelihoods. Victims of sexual and gender-based violence, when they are traumatized, or when they have medical issues that have not been addressed, their livelihoods are shattered. The women, a lot of women that we work with, or it is normal in the Gambian context for women to be dependent on men. If the men they are dependent on are seeing them as unimportant or less of people because of the violations that they encountered, re-victimizing them, it is seen as, or those women are seen as not worth of being supported because of the violations they go through or they have encountered. It basically affects their livelihood in a sense that they have to go an extra mile to be able to fit in. They are thinking about where to go and find work, or the decent jobs that they want to do without being stigmatized. Things that are in their head are being seen, or they help not to think about these issues as their fault, to be able to be supported to go out and find things for themselves and have a decent livelihood, instead of being seen as people who they don't want near them. Housing support, education, their education, like in the case of the April 10 and 11 issue, when the 13-year-old girl was raped, her education was destroyed. She could not go back to school because of the societal expectations that now, because she, this happened to her, she needed to be out of school. She needed to be married. Nobody would want her and whatnot. When she's going out, people are pointing at her, talking about her, and that demoralize people to be, putting them on the side. And as a result, she dropped out of school. Dropping out of school means that your future is not what you wanted, in her own words. If she was in school and did as, well as her colleagues did, who are now, doing very well in her own words, she could have been one of those people today, having to be self-dependent, having to do things that, she wanted to do. She could have been, the greatest athlete that she wanted to do, she wanted to be. Now, these are women that we need to find proper support for. Women that, reparations should not just look at money. It should look at having to support them to, do some kind of adult education, for example, supporting them to be able to, go back and achieve the job opportunities they want to do, let there be structures for people to be able to learn skills, and then we look into how to reintegrate them properly into society. Reintegrating victims of SGBV into society, it is not just supporting victims. It is about helping society understand the damages SGBV can do. It is supporting society understand that there is a lot more to what is happening than, you know, what we can see in the surface, on the surface. Victims are supposed to feel belong. They need to feel that they are part of the community they are in. You know, members need to understand that they have a social duty to be able to support, you know. So reparations should look into all this instead of, you know, what we keep on seeing, which is financial compensation a lot of the times. You know, we should move away from those points and try to look at things properly. A lot of times I keep on saying there are like lots of institutional gaps that also need to be addressed. For example, the African Transitional Justice Policy Report in 2023 did mention that only about 12 African countries, you know, have national reparations policies that are explicitly included, that explicitly include the SGBV. Now, you know, why? You know, how many countries do we have, you know, in Africa that need to understand that we have a role to play in addressing SGBV? It is not just supposed to be seen as a surface thing. It is supposed to be inculcated everywhere. Now, if we are going from the top, but if we are doing a top-bottom approach, the top needs to be really serious about it. And like I said from the start, if the top wants to address SGBV properly, it needs to be in consultation with the victims. The victims, you know, should not, like, we should not always be sitting on the table for the victims. You know, victims must be included. Whatever we are addressing, it must be what the victims want, because what we think they want, even when we go and work with them, the notes we take and, you know, report, yes, they are as accurate as possible, but a lot of the times it is better to hear it from the horse's mouth. A lot of the times it is better to understand that emotional connection, what they are saying, how well it is interpreted, and you know, who feels it knows it. They will be able to express their issues more than we are able to do it for them. So these are some of the things that I think, you know, we need to look into. And finally, the intergenerational impact of SGBV should not be, you know, seen as less important. Victims, the trauma the victims go through, it goes down to their children. It goes down to their children's children. You know, it's like a generational issue that must not be neglected. In the Gambia, for example, if somebody encounters an issue, you know, that is seen as negative, they will insult you, insult your child, you insult your great-grandchildren, your whole generation will be insulted. It is not easily forgotten. So we have a lot more work to do than, you know, yes, progress is happening. You know, I'm not going to discredit that, but what I'm saying is there is a lot more that we need to do than is happening right now. We need to understand that there are so many internalized stigma. We need to understand that, you know, children are suffering. We need to understand that there are so many unspoken words that we need to help victims talk about. We need to help society talk about. We need to help the statistics go down as much as possible. The top needs to connect with the bottom so that we can advance change. Thank you.
Oh, Mariama, thank you so much for that great intervention. You really raised a number of critically important issues. I think firstly, just thank you once again for also highlighting this scary, terrible stats. You know, like Joki did, 2,000 women and girls in Nigeria, 70% of cases in DRC. You know, it really speaks to the urgency of this situation and this issue. And also, I really like the point you make that victims must be included to speak for themselves. This is an issue that primarily silences victims most of the time. And, you know, so just thank you for that, highlighting the importance of ensuring that we bring the victims to the table to speak for themselves. And Yeah, and also even the issue of trauma healing, the importance of trauma healing, and the intergenerational impact that you've just highlighted now. Wow. You know, it really does. It begs the question: how do we support these women? How do we, how do we integrate our different responses? Even as you're speaking about the traditional healing processes, how how do we integrate all of this to ensure that the survivors, that these women and girls get the healing that they need and the healing that they want, and also just amplifying the impact, the shattered livelihoods. It can take away the future of a young girl. You are raped, and now society says, no, go and get married, and you must give up your education, you must give up your life. You know, that it has real consequences, which means, and the fact that sometimes this violence literally just happens because you're a woman, because women's bodies can be used anyhow, because of how women are characterized and understood in our societies. And so I think for me, one of the very critical points or issues that comes out of that is that we cannot just focus on repairing the harm, but we really need to address the reparations model that we utilize. We have to actually address the root causes of this violence beyond just the harm that the women have suffered, because there's a lot more. And I like the way you said it. You said society needs to understand that there's a lot more happening than what we see on the surface. And that is it exactly. I think most times, and it's really to our shame and our discredit that only 12 countries in Africa have included the issue of SGBV in their reparations policy. But this goes to show that we have not understood. We can't, reparations for SGBV cannot just be about, firstly, including them is great, but it can't just be about repairing that harm. Let's address the root causes. Reparations, I think what becomes even more important, especially in this context where SGBV is used as a tool to silence and weaken women. The reparation measures have to, they have to serve as a catalyst for long-term transformation of gender norms, of practices, of gender practices in our societies. We, really what we should be seeking then is to advance gender equality and the inclusion of women. And I think also this transformative dimension, has to be such that we are repairing to ensure that it doesn't even happen in the first place. How do we rebuild our society in such a way that this kind of harm doesn't come to women anymore? And this is emphasized by the AU Convention on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls, which was adopted actually earlier this year in February 2025, which speaks to this as well. It seeks to establish not only a comprehensive, legally binding framework for the prevention and elimination of this violence, but it seeks to establish an effective response that addresses the root causes and drivers of such violence. And really, this is what you were speaking to. And even the Nairobi Declaration on the right of women and girls to a remedy also calls on states to ensure that victims of conflict-related sexual violence, for example, are provided with gender-sensitive reparations as redress for harm suffered, but that the reparations should also provide a route through which to address the disadvantage and discrimination that contributed to and made possible the gendered harm in the first place. And really, I think that's the one great point that your presentation raised today. So thank you so much for your intervention.